Hello everyone and welcome to my studio. This is a dog portrait painting demonstration. So let's start. Again, my first consideration is two questions: where to put it, how big to make it. I also want to look at this as a simple geometrical shape first and just grasp the space that this shape will take. So, in a way, I want to see it as abstractly as possible without identifying any anatomical details and just seeing it as one big shape entering my canvas. I want to see dynamic lines like maybe center line, a stretch. I usually would check with the diagonals of the canvas and maybe place one important details on the diagonal, usually placing an eye or a nose makes a more dynamic painting and more interesting compositional solution. So let's say that moving my brush side to side, which I call a shoelacing method, and that is simply, again, to differentiate the busy space, the space that will be occupied by my portrait, and allowing to see simple design of negative shapes. Of course, all of that will alter as the painting develops. What I want to do is just capture the top of the head and the slant, and then maybe just gauge approximately the bottom chin. This is a very foreshortened pose for this dog. If we would do a profile, you would see a much elongated nose and a muzzle. But the dog is facing us, his head is raised up. So the shapes are moving back, creating the foreshortening. In this case, I have to be very careful in placement of my features. Top plane of the head, side plane of the head. Right now is just the major planes, no small planes. Painting is corrective process. Accuracy is important, but it's not reached at the beginning of the painting. The intention to be accurate is wonderful, but we also know that each brushstroke we put will be not the last one. We will reconsider all of it again. The distance between the eyes in a dog is much wider than what we are accustomed in looking in the mirror. So this is something to consider when you're placing the eye. What I'm going to do is look at the distance between the side plane and the tilt of the eye. There is a echo of this parallel lines, and then I'll just create a simple shape, not in details, trying to stay as much abstract as possible, and just placing the two eyes, double checking the distance. The next thing I will do is again to count for foreshortening. I have to realize that the nose comes very close to the line of the eyes. In fact, if we make our line, the nose will come almost to the same level. And so the relationship between these three features becomes the start of my block in process. Now I can create a diagonal movement from the corners of the eyes and capture the bottom of the nose. So right now, I'm just placing a very flat shapes without any anatomy and dividing on a top plane of the nose and a side plane and a frontal plane. Just again, the space that it will occupy. From the nose, I can move towards describing his little mouth in smile. That partly what gives this dog such a beautiful expression. And then just creating a straight diagonal line to approximate the shape of his face. And then adding on those floppy ears. And then extension of his neck, the fold of the neck, the cast shadow on the body, and then the chest. Here, I might just leave it undone and just concentrate on the face. And now just taking maybe a little bigger brush, picking up more paint. I'm using transparent red oxide and a little bit of phthalo blue to create a darker, slightly cooler variation of this paint. Now just blocking in the shadow shapes. And again, as I'm doing this, I am very much interested in corrective process and seeing better relationship in the shapes. So extending the shadow shapes inside of the ear, extending the shadows to the structure of the eye. Okay. Does this have a hope to become a painting? Yeah, I think it's all a matter of time and patience. Takes time. So it looks like I'm having this face too wide and not long enough. Raise my frontal plane. The more I paint, just by virtue of making brushstroke, I will see my shortcomings and I will be correcting them as I go. So I'm just going to come back to my small brush, anchor the eyes in its placement, slanted down, making sure the nose is wide enough, because if it's not wide enough, that means I probably didn't leave enough space between their eyes. But let's assume this is correct. Now I can take and wipe the top plane of the nose and then create a shadow for the frontal plane. The simple rectangle, a small triangle attached to the bottom. Doesn't matter what you're painting, whether it's a portrait of the dog or a human portrait. I think the more abstractly you can think about it, the more you tend to paint the relationship between the values and colors and the edge relationship. And you are painting the space and the form rather than you are painting particular thing, whether it's a nose or a mouth. So here I created the little structure for the muzzle, separating it. And this is where articulation of the mouth changes. All of those angles are a sign of the changing of the planes and changing of anatomy, making sure I have enough space for the chin. Okay, little cast shadow, and maybe moving the bottom a little lower. I know for some of you, you would prefer to do a pencil drawing or more exact placement of features, and that's okay. We all operate from our comfort level, but there is a benefit of not doing an exact drawing from the beginning, because then the painting becomes a search and becomes process from uncertainty to more certainty. You are coming from less known to articulating with each brushstroke more and more. Naturally develops from more abstract to more accuracy and to more details, rather than coming into life already predetermined by exact drawing. So it's a two different ways of painting, and I tend to advocate more of a fun painting, which is coming and searching for the shapes and searching for likeness and using paint as a sculpting tool to carve out your shapes from the space rather than having the shapes being predetermined by exact drawing. When you see a little bit more resemblance, let's now put a background. Why do we need a background at this stage?